Thank you for joining today's session, Development in a Net Zero World. I'm Kendra Richardson and I'm currently an associate in the Projects, Energy and Infrastructure team here at Brodies, and I'm presenting today with Ryan Bell, who is a solicitor in the real estate team here, and he has a particular focus on renewables. So if we can move to the next slide, we'll have just take a snapshot of what today's session is going to look like. We'll take a quick look at renewables at Brodies and the practice here. We'll give you a bit of an introduction to energy and the energy market generally, just for a bit of scene setting, and then we'll look at the buzz concepts that form the basis of today's session and what those mean for development going forward. And as I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A at the end if anyone wants us to ask us any questions. So if we can move to the next slide. Some learning objectives there, just for the purposes of your CPD. I'll leave you to read them at your own leisure. And then if we move on to the next slide, that really gets us started for today's session. So we did think it was worth saying a bit about the renewables team at Brodies, because some of you might not be familiar with the work we do in this space. We do have a dedicated renewables practice at Brodies, and it encompasses many of our practice areas across the firm. So from real estate to projects, and from corporate and planning and tax and more. And the team really does advise most people that would, or most parties that would be involved in a renewables project, from generators, developers, off-takers, investors and lenders and landowners, and that's across the UK on all aspects of energy transition and projects in the renewable and low carbon sector. And we help them on the building, operating and financing, refinancing, sale and purchase, everything you can see on that infographic there, and you can get more information on our website if you want to know a bit more. But we really can help on the life cycle of energy projects, so from securing options over land, helping secure the planning consents, securing grid connections, offers on suitable terms, to helping procure the turbines themselves, and through to sale of the power that's generated, and financing and refinancing, as I've said. And from crofting and rural land to specialist PPA and financial expertise, we do have experts across all practice areas in the firm that can help to deliver these projects. So if we move to the next slide, we can give you a few examples from both the projects and real estate side, just to give you an idea of the kind of work that we do. So we advised Midlothian Council recently on its joint venture with Vattenfall that will see, at least initially, the installation of a district heating network that's going to provide low carbon heat to new homes at the Shawfair development. We also advised Orbital Marine on its £7 million crowdfunding investment to finance construction of the world's most powerful tidal stream turbines. That was quite exciting. And we also advised Aberdeen City Council on the purchase and fuelling of its green hydrogen buses fleet, which you might have seen in the press. And Ryan, I think you've got a few highlights from the real estate side.
Yep, thanks Kendra. So you can see on screen here a few examples of renewables projects that the Brodies real estate team has been involved in over the course of this year. So this includes offshore wind, onshore wind, solar and gas generation projects. So the examples listed here are all deals which have completed in 2020, which given everything else going on, really shows the resilience of the renewables market. It's also worth mentioning that the real estate team have been advising existing clients of the firm, including some of the heavyweight oil and gas companies, who are now looking to get involved in renewables projects in order to boost their own green credentials. So if you haven't seen this already, you might find that clients or businesses that you work with who have no previous experience in renewables may be in touch over the coming months to discuss renewables opportunities in order to achieve their own green targets. So I will now pass you back to Kendra, who will provide an overview of the energy market on the next slide.
Thanks, Ryan. So before we move on to the buzz concepts that we're going to talk about today, I wanted to take a very quick look at the energy market, just for some context. So the energy market has three key elements. Firstly, generation. So there are lots of companies in the electricity generation sector, from large multinationals through to smaller independents, and then on to micro businesses, and of course homeowners who might be running single turbines, or even some micro generation like solar panels. Transportation, that is of course via the grid or the transmission and distribution networks. There's a more limited fixed pool of parties who operate the transportation network, which I'll say a bit more about later. And finally, supply. So that is very much dominated by the big six who sell energy to end users and consumers and customers. And there are a number of smaller independents, but there have been a lot of failures that you might have read about in the press. It is generally quite a challenging market. But it is also possible to have private wire sale arrangements directly with generators as well. So Ryan's going to say a bit more about generation, if we can move to the next slide.
Thanks, Kendra. So most electricity is still generated at large power stations, which are connected to the national electricity system, although electricity can also be generated in smaller scale power stations, which are connected to regional distribution networks. So the picture has changed a lot in recent years, particularly in Scotland, where with increasing numbers of generators diversifying into renewables. And we're likely to see this trend continue at pace given the current race to net zero. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll have a look at some of the different types of renewables technologies in a bit more detail. So this is stuff that we come across. So as we've mentioned, we work on lots of different types of renewables projects. This slide shows some of them, although I'd be hastened to ask that this is not an exhaustive list. We would also be interested here at the end of this presentation of your involvement in different types of renewables projects. So please do let us know if you have any examples of different types of projects that you've been involved in this year. So let's start off with wind. So wind power in Scotland is the fastest growing energy technology. In the first half of 2019, wind turbines in Scotland generated enough energy to supply its homes twice over. So the type of wind projects we're involved in are onshore wind, offshore wind, and floating offshore wind. So onshore wind is a wide market and ranges from single turbine projects. So these are projects owned by farmers, golf clubs, and other landowners, to the likes of Whiteley Wind Farm near Glasgow, which is the UK's largest onshore wind farm with 215 turbines. So if you've had a chance to get out to the likes of Whiteley Wind Farm, you'll have some understanding of just the scale of these larger wind projects. Scotland also has over 25% of Europe's offshore wind resource, and this is set to increase with the Energy Minister recently announcing the UK government's intention to quadruple offshore wind by 2030. Scotland does have several competitive advantages when it comes to offshore wind, including an already established expertise and experience in offshore oil and gas, a skilled offshore workforce, and excellent port infrastructure. But having said that, offshore conditions in Scotland can make things difficult, and as a result, we have seen a lot of recent offshore development down in England. Now moving on to hydro. So there's a large number of hydro schemes across Scotland, both large and small. So many of the smaller hydro schemes that we come across will be owned or co-owned by landowners in rural areas of Scotland. Scotland now has 85% of the UK's hydroelectric energy resource. And the reason for this is that Scotland has the UK's highest mountains and largest inland lochs, but also combined with a high rainfall, as you all know, this makes production of hydroelectricity viable in the region. The levels of rainfall are generally quite consistent, which means that this is a reliable energy source, and the lifespan of projects are typically much longer than other renewable sources. So the project lifespan for hydro can be up to 50 or 60 years versus around 25 years for a wind farm. Now moving on to have a look at solar. So Scotland and sunshine are by no means synonymous, and I was just looking out the window there, but relying on the sun to produce green energy might seem optimistic in Scotland, particularly at this time of year. Solar, compared to other forms of renewable generation, have shorter build times, they have low risk, high yield returns, and it has higher public support due to lower visual and noise impacts. Scotland only has around 2% of the UK's solar installed capacity, so this is notably low considering the figures that I've just given, showing that we're leaders in both wind and hydroelectric energy. So we have seen a sharp decline in domestic solar installations since 2015 due to the fall in feed-in tariffs, and it is generally regarded that it's only going to get harder for a household to make the numbers stack up. One area of the industrial and commercial market where there has been little progress is on privately leased non-domestic buildings, and there's some chat around the Scottish Government incentivizing growth in this area. So there are potentially hundreds of thousands of hectares of south-facing industrial or commercial roof space, which could accommodate gigawatts of solar. So the potential here is large, and there's a number of actions that the Scottish Government could take to help support the uptake of solar in the industrial commercial market, including introducing energy performance requirements, which encourage landlords to make use of roof space, or offering commercial loans to businesses at a favourable interest rate. We're also beginning to see some innovation in the solar sector. So for example, rotating solar panels, which follow the axis of the sun to maximise exposure. And there's also been discussion around some developers painting the underside of panels or installing reflective material on the ground as to maximise reflection. Let's now move on to have a look at heat. So renewable heat is also becoming an increasing focus given the contribution it makes to our carbon footprint. So this covers a number of different types of projects, including heat pumps, combined heat and boilers, biomass boilers, and more. So broadly, how this works is that there's a source of heat which sends hot water down the pipes to each premises. The hot water is then measured at a meter for consumption and price, and then after use, cool water is returned to the heat source and reheated. We're seeing a lot more of this type of work, and again, this is likely to continue given the current race to net zero. I will now hand you over to Kendra, who's going to discuss how electricity is transported.
Thanks, Ryan. Transportation, just briefly or at a glance, electricity, if we move to the next slide, sorry. Electricity is transported along the network. It's also called the grid. So it's a network of high voltage electricity lines across Britain and electricity interconnectors in nearby offshore waters. So if you think about transmission and distribution lines as motorways and trunk roads and B and C class roads and lanes, the transmission lines are the big pylons or the motorways and the trunk roads, and the distribution lines are the smaller ones, so the ones you see on wooden poles, or the B and C class roads and lanes, if you like. The substation that transforms the voltage from low to high or high to low. There's typically always a substation on a generation project that will connect it to the grid, and there might also be a need to upgrade other existing substations to facilitate a project. We also have interconnectors. They're not shown on that infographic, but they take power to and from Europe. So we currently have 4, and there are several new interconnector projects in various stages of development. Important to note that not all generation connects to the transmission system. Some smaller scale projects will connect directly to the distribution system. Actually, that is very common. We do a lot of work on projects that connect directly to the distribution system. But as to who owns and runs the network did used to be state owned, but it was privatized in '86 for gas and 1990 for electricity. And today the gas and electricity transmission and distribution sections are owned by separate companies. So they're known as transmission network operators, or TNOs, and distribution network operators, or DNOs. And there are different owners in different parts of the country, depending on where you are. It's also worth mentioning that while the network is owned and maintained by regional transmission companies, the system as a whole is operated by a single system operator, and that is the job of National Grid ESO or NG ESO. You might have heard of them that way. So I'm going to pass back to Ryan, who's going to say a bit about constraints and network charges. If we could move to the next slide.
Thanks, Kendra. So I don't feel that we can mention the grid or network without highlighting that the network is highly constrained across the UK, so not only in Scotland. So this leads to long lead-in times for projects, which can wait several years to get connected to the grid. So for example, one of the projects we're currently working on or Kendra's team projects are currently working on has the earliest estimated grid connection in 2024. So when projects connect to the grid, they must pay grid connection costs. So a proportion of these costs are for the works to connect their actual renewables project to the grid, and the proportion of the cost is a contribution to the wider upgrades and or required works to the grid across the UK. So the cost of the wider works is a proportion, and it's based on zonal pound per megawatt of electricity, and this is depending on where the project is based. You might not be surprised to hear that Scotland has 4 out of the 5 of the highest charging zones. Also listed on this slide here are different types of different types of network charges. So networks are seen as natural monopolies as there's no competition, so you must connect to the network through the operator for your area. And this costs, so i.e. you pay to connect to both the grid and you also pay to use it. I will now pass you back over to Kendra, who on the next slide will discuss the sale and supply of electricity.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm just going to mention this very briefly. So there are 2 separate markets for sale and supply of or sale of energy, really, the wholesale market and the retail market. And both are competitive markets, and there are various reasons for that. The general public tend not to strike up energy supply agreements directly with generators. They tend to do that via suppliers. And you will find that many individual consumers often get both their electricity and gas from a single supplier. Generators don't really have the ability to manage multiple contractors, customers rather, so that's invoicing and complaints lines, etc. That's really done by suppliers. And of course, suppliers can buy in bulk from multiple generators and then forward that on to their customers. Important to say that supply must always match demand continuously in real time. So that means that there is a requirement for real-time management to ensure that supply always matches demand and to address any issues with transportation and delivery of power. And that is the role of the system operator that I mentioned earlier, National Grid, ESO. So that is the energy market in a very brief nutshell. There is much more we could say about it, but we will move on, I think, to the next slide. Really just a bit more scene setting, if you like, before we go on to talk about the buzz concepts. Hopefully you'll all agree that it is broadly settled that climate change is happening, and we are now in a climate emergency. And I'm sure that you will all know that the UK and Scotland have legally binding targets to reduce greenhouse gases. So Scotland is targeting net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases by 2045. And also aiming to generate 50% of Scotland's overall energy consumption from renewable sources by 2030, and the UK's net zero target is for 2050. And those targets were really set in the context of international ambition to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. And in 2015, the Paris Agreement upped that global ambition to well below 2 degrees and added an aspirational goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the Paris Agreement also commits signatories to balance greenhouse gases and sinks in the second half of this century. So we've certainly all got a lot to do on this. If we can move to the next slide, we will get on to the buzz concepts. These also could be a session in themselves, so we've tried to keep it quite brief for you. So net zero really refers to achieving an overall balance between emissions produced or emitted into the atmosphere and emissions taken out of the atmosphere. So if you think about it like a bath with the taps on, you can achieve that balance by either turning the taps down, reducing the emissions, or draining an equal amount down the plug, or removing emissions from the atmosphere. And that would include things like storage of the emissions and things such as carbon sinks. Net zero is not gross zero, so gross zero would reduce emissions from all sources to zero, but a net zero emissions target really allows for some residual emissions, and that is more realistic because there are some emissions that are produced by hard to treat sectors, so things like aviation and manufacturing, where reducing emissions is either too expensive or it's technologically too complex or it's simply not possible. And of course, negative emissions can be achieved in a variety of ways, using nature and engineering. So for example, it can involve planting more trees and that kind of thing. Green economy, so far as I'm aware, there is actually no internationally agreed definition of green economy, which is helpful. I think the term was first used in a 1989 report, Blueprint for a Green Economy, and that was a report that was commissioned by the UK government to advise if there was a consensus on the definition of the term sustainable development and the implications that would have for measuring economic progress. But it seems that the term wasn't actually used with any particular meaning or purpose in that report. And since then, there have been several definitions, including the ones that we've got on the slide there. So UNEP defines it as one that results in improved human well-being and social equity, while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. It is a low carbon, resource efficient and socially inclusive. And the Green Economy Coalition succinctly defined it as a resilient economy that provides a better quality of life for all within the ecological limits of the planet. Essentially, a green economy has three objectives: economic recovery, poverty eradication, and reduced carbon emissions and ecosystem degradation. And finally, green economy, that is the widely adopted name for a package of environmental, regulatory and fiscal reforms to recover prosperity after the COVID-19 pandemic. And it really focuses on long-term policies and solutions that are designed to benefit both people and planet. So it includes measures that might focus on safeguarding the environment and addressing issues relating to climate, but it also includes creating a resilient, sustainable and inclusive society. So that sets the scene for what we're going to talk about next. If we can move on to the next slide, and really what does all of that mean for development? Well, we have noted a few ideas down which we'll go into a bit more detail about, but you might have already seen firsthand in your day-to-day work how these concepts and these buzz concepts are influencing or will influence developments going forward. And if you do have experience, then do please feel free to share them, and we can talk about those when we come to the Q&A section. But if we could move to the first slide, we wanted to talk first about more policy, more renewables. And just a few weeks ago, I'm sure you'll all have seen that Boris Johnson published a 10-point plan to tackle climate change, deliver net zero and launch a green industrial revolution, another green buzz concept there. But the plan really sets out the UK government's approach to building back better, supporting green jobs and accelerating the path to net zero. It includes lots of measures, but to pull out a few on offshore wind, we're talking about quadrupling how much we produce to 40 gigawatts by 2030 and supporting up to 60,000 jobs, and on homes and public buildings, making our homes, schools and hospitals greener, warmer and more energy efficient, creating 50,000 jobs by 2030. And there's also a fairly ambitious target to install 600,000 heat pumps every year by 2028. And Scotland is in the process of updating its climate change plan to reflect the increased ambition of the new targets that were brought in last year. Of course, next year, I'm sure you'll all have seen that we are due to host in Glasgow the next UN Climate Summit. If you're not familiar with COP26, COP just means Conference of Parties. It's a summit of all the countries that are part of the UN's Climate Change Treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there are over 190 members. And COP26 is really critical because it's the biggest summit that the UK has ever hosted. And it's being described as the most significant climate change event since the 2015 Paris Agreement, because parties from all around the world that are parties to the treaty will be reporting back on progress since the Paris Agreement, and hopefully there will be some new decisions on how we cut carbon emissions. So Scotland and the UK really are in the spotlight when it comes to climate change, and I think we can absolutely expect more policy and strategy papers to come. Notably, as we've mentioned, the UK must quadruple the amount of renewable electricity that's deployed by 2050 in order to meet its climate change targets. And in Scotland, to meet the Climate Change Committee's most ambitious speculative scenario, Scotland must install 134 gigawatts of renewable electricity generation to meet net zero by 2045. So that does mean, I think, we can all agree, lots more renewable energy projects. There are, of course, limits to to what type of developments can go where across the country, and deployment of renewables will very much depend on things like the availability of subsidies, which we'll talk a bit about later, or where there's no subsidy available, the appetite of developers and investors to develop subsidy-free, which we have seen laterally with onshore wind as the cost of developing that out has come down. But ultimately, I think it is very much settled amongst industry and government that renewables really do need to be deployed at scale over the coming years to meet these targets. So almost certainly more policy is coming, and more renewable projects can certainly be expected, which you may encounter day to day. If we can move to the next slide. Energy efficiency, there has been a lot of policy around heat and energy efficiency in recent times. So we had heat policy in 2015, we had a Scottish energy strategy in 2017, an energy efficient Scotland route map in 2018, and local heat and energy efficiency strategies in 2017 and 18, which some of you might have had the pleasure of dealing with. And then we've had a bit of a gap, and I think the intention had been to maintain that momentum, but other things have got in the way, particularly this year, of course, with the pandemic. An update on that route map and the decarbonisation of heat policy had both been anticipated this year, but I think those are going to be combined into a new heat and building strategy that the Scottish Government has said will be published before the end of this year, although there isn't much of this year left, to be fair. And there is also a heat pump sector deal in development as well. So as you can see from this slide and the next one, there is a fair bit happening in this space, but to touch on a couple of things, because there is a lot of information there. I anticipate 2024 regulations may bring in the rules prohibiting gas boilers in new homes from 2024. And there are various requirements for EPCs and energy efficiency in existing buildings, which vary depending on the type of stock. The energy efficiency domestic private rented Scotland, domestic private rented property Scotland regulations is a bit of a mouthful. They were due to come into force in the 1st of April 2020, but they have been paused due to COVID, which is perhaps a bit of relief among some private landlords who have maybe struggled to implement energy efficiency measures to meet those requirements during the pandemic. And I think the concerns of that sector have been fairly well documented in the press. And then if we move on to the next slide, this one, as you can see again, some energy performance requirements for existing non-domestic buildings, and lots of the standards and targets that had been expected to be developed haven't really come forward as expected, but we can certainly expect that they will come forward in the near future. But that does neatly bring us on to heat networks and regulation of the heat sector generally, and building owners and developers really need to be aware of how that might affect buildings and development going forward. So heat networks, I do a fair bit of work on heat networks. Heating buildings is a significant proportion of Scotland's emissions. 15% of total emissions come from heating our homes, so it is quite a big proportion. And to achieve the targets, we really need our buildings to become more energy efficient and heating systems to transition to low carbon and renewable sources. But amongst all of that, there are wider social benefits with health, both in homes and in terms of air quality generally, and in terms of reducing or even eradicating fuel poverty. And as I mentioned, there is a wealth of policy around heat and decarbonising heat, but most recently in Scotland, we've had the Heat Network Scotland Bill, which has made its way into the Scottish Parliament. So the bill is really enabling legislation that sets out a framework to enable secondary legislation or regulations. So there is lots of detail still to come, which the Scottish Government has acknowledged frequently in its policy documents that sit alongside the bill. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because including more of the detail in secondary legislation enables a bit of flexibility and allows policy to be a bit more responsive as the market develops. Although on the flip side, there is the risk of there being less scrutiny at the detail at this stage. But the bill was introduced on the 2nd of March, and evidence has been heard, and a committee report will be produced before it moves to the amendment stage. It's expected to be law by March 2021, and if it's not, it will unfortunately fall. But secondary legislation is in development now, with the first licences expected in 2023-24, assuming the legislation passes. So it does cover quite a lot of things. It includes licenses for network operators, existing and new operators of district heating networks. It includes powers for license holders, including network wayleave rights to take pipes up to buildings, and it includes network zones and permits, amongst other things. So this is regulation in what is an almost completely unregulated sector. So it's a start, but there are certainly still lots of gaps and lots of detail to come, as we say, and we really could do a whole session on the bill itself. Heat is such an important aspect of the race to net zero. We have done a blog and an article on the bill if you want to get more information on what it includes and more importantly what it doesn't include, which you can find on our website. But for the moment, I think it's suffice to say that regulation of the heat sector is coming. And while the strength of its bite is maybe still to be seen, the carbon footprint of our heating, heating our homes and buildings means that district heating or low carbon heating is increasingly likely to feature in developments that you might work on in the coming years. And I think Dundee is an example of how that might be seen in practice. So Dundee City Council does have a policy that requires developers to demonstrate that they've considered district heating in their proposed developments. I think it's in the form of a checklist, but their planning authority presumes that developers will consider district heating systems and what future proofing would be needed if it's not suitable at this stage. And just earlier this week, on Monday, I think it was, their councillors were considering approval of new guidance for developers, and according to the council's planning committee, that new district heating systems policy makes going through the relevant checklist a material consideration in decisions on planning applications for future developments. So that is an approach that we might see adopted by other local authorities going forward. And from homes to cars, Ryan's going to say a bit about electric vehicles, if we can move to the next slide.
Thanks, Kendra. So you may have seen the announcement a couple of weeks ago in November that sales of new petrol and diesel cars and vans will be phased out by 2030. So whether or not this is achieved, it is clear that there will be a marked increase in ownership of electric vehicles over the coming years. And this poses a number of questions, two key questions being, how will local authorities develop the existing charge point infrastructure to meet this change in market? And what will the planning implications be as new charge points are installed both commercially and domestically? So Charge Place Scotland is Scotland's national electric vehicle charging network. So this is owned and developed by the Scottish Government and funded in partnership through a public grant from local authorities and other organisations. So Charge Place Scotland's aim is to install charge points across Scotland from Shetland to the Scottish borders, making owning an electric vehicle accessible for all Scottish drivers. So Charge Place Scotland network has grown from around 55 public charge points in 2013 to now over 1,500 in 2020. But if you're looking at the targets for 2030, there's clearly still a long way to go. So we'd be interested to hear from you again if this is an issue, the issue of charging points is something that is coming up on maybe new developments that you're involved in, or in relation to existing commercial industrial sites. So we're obviously aware that perhaps new shopping centres or offices that are being developed need to have a certain percentage of electric charge point car parking spaces. But if this is set to increase over the next 10 years, there's also going to be a lot of changes in this area. So be interesting to hear if you've had much experience or it's something that clients of yours or businesses that you work with have started discussions with you about. I will now pass you back to Kendra, who will be discussing on the next slide, innovation in the renewable sector.
Thanks, Ryan. So innovation is really another buzzword, really, but the nature of renewables is that it's always changing and evolving and developing. And I think you only have to look at the first wind turbines that were developed and those that they build out now to see just how rapidly things can change and at what scale. But renewable projects can really only export to the grid when they can generate and when there's demand for the power that they generate. So if we take wind farms as an example, that project can really only generate when the wind is blowing. If there's demand for energy but the wind is not blowing, or it's blowing too strongly, then the project can't really export to the grid, and it can't generate funds. But what about when the wind is blowing but there's no demand, for example, in the middle of the night? So supply and demand do need to be constantly balanced. So if there's no demand, the project can't generate electricity because it would oversupply the system. And if more electricity is generated than is needed, then there are times when the power cables can reach full capacity and production has to be capped or curtailed, and some projects need to be switched off or switched down. And that renewable energy it goes unharnessed. So that is why battery storage technology, for example, is such an important development, because in those circumstances, the project could generate electricity or the energy and store it to the battery. And when there is demand but no wind, the project could supply the grid from the battery. And really, if businesses want to go off grid, they will almost certainly need battery storage. So I think we can expect to see more battery storage, more co-location of different technologies. It's not just batteries that could be co-located. So things like wind and solar, we've seen examples of that, and wind and tidal as well, and much more innovation to come in a similar vein as well. So on the next slide, what we wanted to touch on last was subsidies and grants. There has been some activities around subsidies and grant funding recently. So Contracts for Difference, CFD Round 4 allocation opens in 2021. Crown Estate Scotland launched its first cycle of Scotland leasing in June this year, and that is the first round of seabed leasing for offshore wind farms in Scottish waters for a decade, so for up to 10 gigawatts of offshore wind. South of the border, we've had Crown Estate UK, also officially launched the invitation to tender stage 1 for the 4th round of offshore wind leasing there, which is offering seabed rights for at least 7 gigawatts of projects in waters around England and Wales. And at the end of November, just there, the UK government announced in its spending review quite a chunk of cash for net zero funding. So it includes £3 billion to help the UK reach net zero, and billions for research and development and innovation projects. That includes nearly £1.9 billion to be spent on EV infrastructure and grants for zero and ultra low emissions vehicles. But what about Scotland? Well, the Scottish budget, which was published in February before the pandemic really took hold, and the programme for government, which was published in September this year, they've both been framed around net zero with strong policy commitments. And as part of the Scottish budget, the Scottish Government announced a raft of new funding to accelerate progress towards net zero, including £1.8 billion of investment in low carbon infrastructure. There is a £120 million heat transition deal, more than £64 million of planting of new forests to act as carbon sinks, which you've mentioned before, and around £40 million on transforming how farmers interact with the environment as well. Now, of course, the devil is really in the detail. We're still waiting to see how that money is going to be distributed in practice, but I suppose what is clear is that there is a financial commitment as well as a policy commitment to climate change and net zero from both the UK and Scottish governments. And if we can move to the next slide, you'll also see that there is some financial support available for businesses, in particular SMEs. Information you can get through the Energy Savings Trust and Zero Waste Scotland as well. And of course, for domestic consumers, because we are, of course, each one of those, there is support through Home Energy Scotland, which is set up by the Energy Saving Trust. There are also private consultants that will offer advice and support, but they're typically not free. We've noted some of the financial support and incentives that are available on the slides there. They include area-based schemes that are managed by local authorities. We've got Warmer Home Scheme, which is available for eligible households through Home Energy Scotland. Also, Zero Waste Scotland provides loans for SMEs, and again, the Scottish Government recently announced funding for a cashback scheme on these loans for the installation of renewable heat, and there is support available for landlords as well, some landlords and householders. So I definitely encourage you to look into those if you think they are going to be of interest to your client but also to yourselves as individuals as well. So those are just a few ideas that we've had on how these buds concepts might affect development now and in the future. You absolutely may have more. If you do, we'd absolutely love to hear them. And with that, we are happy to invite questions, because that does bring us to the end of the formal part of the presentation. As I say, we are happy to take questions, but equally, if anyone wants to ask us anything offline, then our contact details are on the last slide there. And you can, of course, find us on the Brodies website or via LinkedIn. Just check if we've got any questions.
Yeah, I don't think we've got any so far. If anyone's got any questions, just pop them in the Q&A down the bottom.
We stunned you all into silence.
Must be it.
Well, I don't think we've got any questions, so I'll let you all, we'll let you all get away. But it just leaves me, on behalf of myself and Ryan, to thank you for joining today's session, particularly in December, when there are no drinks or snacks on offer either. And of course, we do hope that you have a merry but very safe holiday season. So thank you all very much for joining.